Hello everybody, this is Dr. Christopher White and welcome back for part 3 of Evolution Part 1. So before we go any further, let's just get the code word out of the way. The code word for this presentation is gold. I repeat, gold, G-O-L-D, like the precious metal. So one more time, that code word is gold. Please make sure you write that down because you'll need it for the code word quiz. So what's the modern view of evolution? So during the 1930s and the 1940s, you had a mixture of paleontologists, geneticists, population biologists, and others develop ideas that merged to become what's called the modern synthesis. So to put it another way, it's also called neo-Darwinism. Excuse me. So what it did is it incorporated the original model of Darwinian evolution, and it added to it what we've learned on a range of topics, most importantly involving chromosomes and the inheritance of genetic characteristics. So what also got added is the inclusion of mutations as well. And of course it's these mutations which actually begin to provide the variation which we see in a population. So unfortunately by this point, Lamarck's idea of inheritance by acquired characteristics was fully rejected, so that's gone now. And natural selection was reaffirmed based on this work, so Darwin's original theory was, backed up by the data available. So in terms of modern evolutionary thinking, we think of it more of as a population rather than an individual that is evolving. So what we have are individuals whose genetic blueprint provides favourable traits. They're more likely to survive and leave more descendants than others, so they become a greater portion of the population, and therefore the descendant population has these favourable traits in greater frequency, and so over time the numbers of individuals within that population with these favourable traits will become higher and higher. So that's slightly different. Rather than just thinking about how it affects one individual, you start to think about the population as a whole, and that makes sense really when you think about it, because the evolution of one species from another doesn't just occur using one individual, it occurs as a population. So by considering the effects on the population rather than single individuals, it clearly shows how a variant can quickly emerge, and how that the emergence of that variant can very quickly lead to the appearance of a completely new species. So we now need to answer what brings about the variation. So of course natural selection works on these variations. If we didn't have them, natural selection wouldn't happen. So most variations arise from the reshuffling of genes during sexual reproduction, because it's pretty random what genetic information, what part of the genetic sequence you get in each sex cell. So this means the possible variation is massive, because of course chromosomes contain thousands of genes, each gene has 2 or more alleles, and half of those go to the offspring. So you can see that it's very the possible options are huge. And of course we need to remember these variations are already present, they are in the genetic material, and as such it's just a result of how you shuffle the deck, to say what genetic variation you get. So we can also have the appearance of new variation through the process of mutation, and this is the change in a chromosome or gene. So mutations will change the hereditary information, and because they're part of the genetic makeup, as long as that mutation occurs in a sex cell, it can then be passed on to the next generation. So in terms of the types of mutations we can get, we can have chromosomal mutations, and these affect a large portion of the chromosome, and as such it will affect many genes. Or you can have point mutations, which will just focus on one gene in particular. And as I just said, as long as those mutations take place in the sex cells, that new mutation will be transferable to the next generation. Because we have to remember, only the genetic information in the sex cells is exchanged. So in theory, you can have mutations that occur in other cells, however, those mutations will not be transferable. So mutations are random with their respect to fitness, so a mutation can be beneficial, it can do no harm, or it can actually be harmful. So if a species is well adapted to its environment, most mutations will not be particularly useful and could actually be harmful. And so this means that once an organism is very well adapted to its environment, what you can see is that it won't really change very much. Because as soon as you start adding new things onto the animal or changing things, chances are it's actually going to be to the detriment of the animal. So some harmful mutations can be beneficial if the environment changes. So this goes back to the plants we were discussing a few slides ago when we were thinking about plants that grew in contaminated soil around now disused mines. And under normal circumstances, the enzymes that allow these plants to live in this contaminated soil, well, they would actually be harmful to the plant if it was growing in regular soil. However, as soon as the environment changes, the presence of these enzymes is actually beneficial. So it doesn't take too much for a mutation which could in theory be detrimental to an animal to all of a sudden actually become something that's beneficial. And as soon as it becomes beneficial, natural selection is going to want to increase the frequency of it. So how can you actually have a neutral mutation? So that's a mutation that isn't really going to, be beneficial or harmful. So the amino acids in DNA directs the formation of proteins, which we use to make new cells. So the sequence of amino acids in the DNA controls what the sequence of amino acids in DNA controls what amino acids are used to build the protein molecules. So essentially the DNA is the blueprint, and the blueprint is what's used to construct new protein molecules. And so the DNA gives you a specific sequence in which the amino acids have to be put to form the protein molecule that you want. So a neutral mutation changes the order of amino acids in the DNA. However, the changes it produces can either have no effect, and essentially you end up with the same protein being synthesized regardless, or it can make a minor change which has no real significant effect on the usefulness of that protein. So you might end up with a slightly different protein, but it still does exactly the same thing as as the original protein would do, and so nothing has really changed. So what causes mutations? So some mutations are caused by things which we call mutagens. And these are agents that cause a higher rate of mutation. Some of these include things like chemicals, ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, alpha and beta particles, and extreme temperature change. Some mutations are also spontaneous and no mutagen is involved. So sometimes when the genetic information is being copied in a cell to make new cells, every once in a while that copying process goes slightly wrong and the new genetic material being produced is changed in some way, and this can also lead to a mutation, and that's going to be called a spontaneous mutation because once again no mutagen is involved in that instance. So now we need to think about speciation and the rate of evolution. So speciation is the phenomenon of a new species arising from an ancestral species. So we think about its rate and the way in which this change takes place. So the term species refers to a population of similar individuals who have the capacity to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So a species is reproductively isolated from other species. So our definition cannot be applied to bacteria because they produce asexually. Now, this divide saying one species can't interbreed with another species is not actually 100% solid. So some different species can interbreed successfully, and that's because they have a very recent common ancestor. But when that happens, the offspring are normally sterile. So examples of this include horses and zebras interbreeding to give us zebroids, camels and llamas interbreeding to give us camas, goats and sheep interbreeding to give us geeps. Now, interestingly, geeps are actually fertile, which is quite interesting. We also have early humans and Neanderthals interbreeding to produce modern day humans, and we can see the input of Neanderthal DNA into populations in Europe, the Middle East, and Northern Asia. Once again, the offspring produced was fertile. So you can have different species interbreeding successfully in the right circumstances, although it doesn't normally happen. However, most evolutionary change takes place exclusively within individual species. So the emergence of a new species from an ancestral species is termed speciation. So the evolution of a species will occur on two scales. So the first scale is called microevolution, and these are small changes within a species that are enough to produce a distinct new organism. So over time, all these little changes will build up, and eventually you'll end up with a completely new species evolving. So an example of that are house sparrows. So house sparrows came to the United States in 1852, and the northern birds very quickly evolved to become larger and darker in colour, because obviously conditions in the fall and winter especially are much colder, so being larger is advantageous. It helps you retain more body heat, and being darker in colour allows you to absorb more sunlight, so you can absorb the heat from that sunlight, also helping to keep you warm. So the ones that exist in more southern states where it's warmer, they'd never really adapted from the original house sparrows. They're like the original species that was introduced. However, these more northern variants, as I say, became larger and darker, and so they're now considered to be a completely separate and distinct species. The other type of evolution which can occur is macroevolution, and this involves significant changes producing a new species, genus, family, order, or class. So essentially what we have happening here is essentially major change taking place. So this would be the kind of process that would take reptiles and essentially allow for the evolution of mammals. So it's multiple changes occurring over long periods of time, allowing a completely new class of animal to appear. So for instance, amphibians evolving from fish, mammals evolving from reptiles, and whales evolving from their land-dwelling ancestors. These are very, very significant changes. So the cumulative effect of the microevolution accounts for macroevolution. So they only really differ in the degree of change. So these changes tend to be on a smaller scale, so they'll just lead to the formation of a new species. However, when you combine enough of them together, it can actually lead to macroevolution, which is where you get an entire new class of organism appearing. So in terms of speciation, it's caused by changes in the genetic makeup of a population, and it may bring about changes in form and structure. So there are a few different types of speciation. So the first type is allopatric speciation, and this occurs when you have a small population that becomes isolated from the parent population. So once separated, the populations will share little, if any, genetic material. So once the population is by itself, that's essentially the genetic material which that population has to work with. So isolation can result in things like mountain ranges forming, or maybe a few individuals ending up in a remote location. So the classic example will be some birds flying along the coast. They get pushed out to sea by a very, very strong wind, for instance. They get carried miles and miles over the ocean, and of course whilst they're there, they're looking for somewhere to land, and they just happen to spot an island, and that's where they land. But the problem is they've been blown so far off course, there's no way they could ever make it back to the mainland where they began, so they're now trapped there. You can also have populations becoming separated due to rising sea levels. So here's the example of allopatric speciation. So we have a group of 4 islands off the coast of a larger landmass over here. So what's happening is a few individuals from the mainland species get isolated on island number 1. So let's say it was some birds flying along here, a strong wind pushed them out to sea, they spotted island number 1 to land, but unfortunately island number 1 is so far from the main landmass that they can't fly back, so they're trapped there. And so what will happen is natural selection will start to kick in and the animals will begin to adapt to the environment on island number 1. So over time, we're going to have the birds which are now adapted to island number 1. Well, they're going to spot island number 2 on the horizon. And so some of the birds from island number 1 are going to fly over to island number 2, where they will begin to diverge from the birds on island number 1, and they will begin to adapt to the conditions on island number 2. And so what we're going to end up with is given enough time, a new species of bird appearing on island number 2. We can then have birds from island number 2 going to island number 3 and island number 4, once again adapting to the conditions on those islands, so we end up with new species. And in some cases we can have maybe birds from island number 2 returning to island number 1. These birds from island number 2 may outcompete the birds from island number 1, and so get rid of them. Or they may not be successful and the birds from island number 1 may remain dominant, or maybe the two populations will interbreed, producing once again some kind of intermediate species. So there's lots of possibilities that can go on. And this is the kind of process that happened on the Galapagos Islands with the finches. So the finches got blown out to sea, so they were on the main continental landmass of South America. They got blown out to sea probably by strong winds and they became isolated on the Galapagos Islands. And so, as we've discussed, each different type of finch adapted to the local conditions on each island. So, although allopatric speciation is widely agreed upon, there are disagreements about how quickly a new species might evolve. So you have to think to yourself, okay, is evolution a very slow and gradual process, or does it actually occur quite quickly? So this gives us two different types of evolution. The first one is phyletic gradualism, and this says that minor changes gradually accumulate and a new species will arise gradually and continually. So what we're saying is there will be a constant non-stop conveyor belt going on. Some species will die out. Another species will adapt to that environment and will take it over, and you'll see a steady, gradual change as species disappear and new species appear to take their place. The most important thing is this is a non-stop process. It's constantly going on. The other option is called punctuated equilibrium. And in this instance, what we have is little or no change taking place in a species population for long periods of time. But then what happens is evolution occurs rapidly, likely in response to some kind of very sudden change in conditions. And one of the classic examples of this would be something like the KT mass extinction. So that's at the end of the Cretaceous as you transition into the Cenozoic, and of course we know that's the mass extinction which killed off the dinosaurs. And I'm sure you know it was the result of a meteorite impact. And of course what happened there was we had a very rapid change in environmental conditions. All of a sudden, animals like the dinosaurs suddenly found themselves at a significant evolutionary disadvantage, so they became extinct. And this meant that there was lots and lots of environments suddenly left open which could be exploited. And so there were two groups of animals that could exploit these environments. There were the mammals and the birds. And so what you see in the fossil record is as you entered into the Cenozoic, you suddenly see evolution in the mammals and the birds explode as they're trying to compete with each other to take over these environments that are now open because the dinosaurs are gone. And initially, actually, the birds win, but slowly over time the mammals manage to outcompete them. So in the case of punctuated equilibrium, what you have is a new species rapidly appearing. Normally in the space of only a few thousand years, because evolution is kicking in very, very quickly. The organism is desperately trying to exploit that new environment before another species comes in and beats them. So on the whole, scientists that support punctuated equilibrium point out that there are actually very few examples of gradual transitional change. When we look at the fossil record, a lot of evolution seems to be driven by these short-term, quite extreme changes in environmental conditions. However, there are also examples of gradualism within the fossil record as well. So something like, little organisms that float in the oceans, so something like foraminifera, we can see gradual evolution occurring over time. So both of these processes do function. However, based on what we can see in the fossil record, it would actually seem that the majority of evolution is actually driven by punctuated equilibrium. These sudden changes making some species suddenly become uncompetitive, so they die out, environments open up, and then the remaining species rush into those environments and try and adapt to them to become the dominant species within this new environment. So, regardless of how new species arise and how quickly it happens, if evolution is correct, we should see speciation occurring now. So, we can see it in the fossil record. The question is do we have any modern examples of this? And luckily, we do. So, the example below deals with birds that live in the semi-separated populations. So, what we have here is we have a species of greenish warblers, okay, and they're going to be starting off here, so essentially on the southern edge of the Tibetan Plateau. And the population is going to go in two ways. One part of the population is going to go east, the other part of the population is going to go west. And so obviously as these populations pushed eastwards and westwards, they're going to encounter new environments, and obviously they're going to have to adapt to those new environments. So our initial population is going to go one way, that's going to lead to the evolution of species A, and if it goes the other way, it's going to lead to the evolution of species B. And then the further we move away from our starting location, the more change is occurring. So now we have species C arising from species B, and species F arising from species G. Species F arising from species A. And then as the animals keep migrating, we have species G arising from species F, and we have species D arising from species C, and then D gives us E. And then eventually what we have is G essentially giving rise to H. And so what we have are these two separate populations. One goes one way, one goes the other. You have multiple species forming in between as they move around the Tibetan Plateau. And eventually they make it to the northern margin of the Tibetan Plateau, so now we're up in Siberia, and so we have one population here, but where they meet, although they are still relatively similar and in theory they could interbreed successfully, they don't, because by the time they're here they are very, very different. So for instance, they don't recognize each other because there's very differences in the song, the wing color, and also there are genetic differences as well, and so this means you have two isolated species that will not interact with one another. And so we can see this happening in the natural world now. So the next thing we need to think about are what are the types of evolution. And there's three types of evolution. It's called divergent, convergent, and parallel. And I would very strongly advise you to make sure you take notes about this part, because the different types of evolution do have a very strong chance of appearing in exams. So paleontologists refer to an ancestral species giving rise to diverse descendants as divergent evolution. So an example of divergent evolution would be the ancestor species that gave rise to a range of different animals, so platypuses, armadillos, rodents, bats, primates, whales, rhinoceroses, etc. All of those warm-blooded species, essentially they all are the result of divergence from one ancestor species. So this is the classic model for divergent evolution. We have our common ancestor, and from that common ancestor we have multiple diverse species evolving. So these descendants are markedly different from one another, and they are markedly different from the ancestor. Now, in contrast, convergent and parallel evolution are processes whereby similar adaptations arise in different groups. So these two processes will differ in the degree of adaptations, and sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish one from the other. So what's convergent evolution? So convergent evolution is the development of similar characteristics in distantly related organisms. So we have a similar characteristic appearing in organisms which under normal circumstances are very genetically different, and as such you would not expect them to look similar, but they do. So I'm actually going to jump to the next slide. So a great example of this process of convergent evolution are ichthyosaurs, dolphins, and sharks. So an ichthyosaur is a marine reptile, which is now extinct. Dolphins are marine mammals, and sharks are fish, essentially. They're cartilaginous fish. And so we have three very, very different organisms from very different groups. However, you will notice that evolution has led to them forming the same basic body shape. You have a long, slender body which can move through the water easily. You have the fins at the front for steering. You have a tail for propulsion. You have this pointed nose. And you also have the back fin as well. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing the traits appearing in each of these different species, even though they are extremely distant genetically from one another. And the reason these similarities occur is because they are the correct adaptations for that environment. This body shape works in water. And so what will happen is because it works, evolution will naturally kick in and it will encourage the traits that will lead to a body design like this to become dominant. The other type of evolution is parallel evolution. So in the case of parallel evolution, we have the development of similar characteristics in closely related organisms. So in both cases, the similar characteristics develop separately because the organisms in question adapt to comparable environments. So we've discussed convergent. So in the case of convergent evolution, the same basic design keeps popping up because it works. In the case of parallel evolution, a good example would be something like elephants, mammoths, and mastodons. And they are closely related. And because they're closely related, you can see they have very, very similar designs in the first place. And in a lot of instances, they were actually living in environments which were similar. And so what happens is each of them adapts to the environment, but the same basic design is going to occur again and again because they're trying to exploit the same environment. And so the same adaptations will be helpful. But in the case of parallel evolution, the organisms in question are naturally very closely related to each other. In the case of convergent evolution, the organisms in question are very distantly related to each other. So in both cases, you have similar traits appearing. It's just a question of how closely related are the populations. So this brings us on to the process of mosaic evolution. So in the case of mosaic evolution, we have evolutionary change. It doesn't typically occur. Let's try that again. Evolutionary change doesn't normally involve all aspects of an organism at the same time. So typically what will happen is some kind of selection pressure will drive the selection of a specific feature due to a specific need. So this means that key features associated with a descendant group may still be present. So some features might still work. So evolution's not going to kick in, because if you have, a part of your body that already functions correctly and it's useful in the environment which you're trying to exploit, well, in that situation, you don't actually need to evolve that particular organ or body part, do you? So an example of mosaic evolution are birds. So birds have feathers and fused clavicle. So a fused clavicle is a wishbone, a collarbone. And these features are shared with the earliest birds or dinosaurs, for want of a better way of describing them. And so what we have these adaptations which come all the way from the ancestor species, continuing all the way into the modern day species. So we have the fused clavicle, the collarbone, and obviously we have the evolution of feathers. And so this represents mosaic evolution. So you can see, when you think about it the other way, for instance, the forelimb design. So this is Archaeopteryx, which is a kind of dinosaur bird hybrid. And this is a modern day bird. And you can see the wing design is significantly different. So some features, like the fused clavicle, has persisted, but other features have over time evolved and changed, depending on the need of the organism. So organisms have recently evolved some characteristics while other features are retained from the ancestral group because they work. And obviously this makes sense. So, why would you, try and change something if it functions correctly and performs its job well? And so this allows us to be able to actually see, visually some of the similarities between different species, and it allows us to be able to gauge, how closely related they are to each other. Okay, so we're going to stop part 3 here. So once again, pause the video, get up, have a walk around, go and get a drink of water, and then come back for part 4 when you're ready.